Trippelt välkommen tillbaka säger vi till cheeseburgarnas cheeseburgare. Ja, vi pratar såklart om triple cheese på McDonald's. Lika god som vår cheeseburgare, fast trippelt. Bara på McDonald's.
Det är festivalsäsong och det betyder massor av lera. Så Alex surfade in på Amazon för att hitta ett tält som rymmer upp till 5 torra vänner, en mysig campingsäng, skön och leopardmönstrade gummistövlar. Miau! Nu får Alex hantera precis lagom mycket lera för att vara Alex, vilket är betydligt mindre lera än för den där leriga dansande mannen där borta. Men vänta, har han bara lera på sig? Japp, bara lera. Håll dig torr, får det att hända. Hitta det på amazon.se.
Den lilla gäststugan jag sitter i när jag spelar in det här kallas jungfruburen. För 50 år sedan var det ett oskuldsfullt skämt när dottern i familjen som bodde här brukade sova i den här gäststugan med sina kompisar. Jag kan inte tänka mig en mer passande plats att spela in en intervju med Ayaan Hirsi Ali än denna. För 17 år sedan skrev hon till och med en bok som heter just The Caged Virgin med undertiteln An Emancipation Proclamation for Women and Islam. Den boken handlade om hur kvinnor inom islam förtrycks, hur deras fri- och rättigheter kringskärs på sätt efter sätt. Det handlade om hennes egen frigörelse från islams förtryck och om islamisters framfart i Europa, men även om feministers och vänsterns svek mot muslimska kvinnor som de låter förtryckas utan att protestera. Sedan dess har mycket hänt och väldigt lite har faktiskt blivit bättre. Hennes nya bok som nu ges ut på svenska på Fri Tanke förlag heter Villebråd, immigration, islam och kvinnors rättigheter. Det hon beskriver är hur alla kvinnor drabbas av det som sker till följd av massmigrationen från muslimska länder. Så här skriver hon. Män som föraktar kvinnor begränsar dock sällan sitt förakt till kvinnor med samma bakgrund som de själva. En del muslimska män föraktar alla kvinnor, inklusive europeiska kvinnor. Kvinnor som hade tagit det för givet att de hade uppnått en nivå av frigörelse som särskilde dem från muslimska kvinnor. Det som skedde muslimska kvinnor igår sker nu alla kvinnor idag, i hennes tes. Själv lever hon fortfarande på hemlig adress i USA efter att ha lämnat islam bakom sig. Hon lämnade en bur som islam satt runt henne. Men nu har hoten från islamister gjort att hon lever i en annan sorts bur. En mycket svart ironi. Du lyssnar på Rak Höger med mig, Ivar Arpi. Welcome, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, to Rak Höger.
Thank you very much, Ivar, for having me.
So we were gonna have this. I was gonna interview you a few months back, but then I thought that I might have contracted COVID, so it got cancelled. So I'm very happy to have you on now instead.
Thank you for having me. So, was the COVID test negative?
Yes, it was just regular hypochondria. I've managed to stay clear of COVID.
Very good.
I hope I will in the future as well. But
Yes.
your book has then when we were going to do the interview, it was because of your book Pray. But now it's also coming out in Swedish with the Swedish
Yes.
title Villebråd, and it's from Fri Tanke, who publishes the book. So basically, the book is about how large-scale immigration from countries where you have a very different view of women and the place of women is having an effect on women's rights and freedoms in the Western world and especially Western Europe. Is that a correct summary?
That's a correct summary, yes.
So, when you read the book, you get, I would say, it's a very hard read because there's so much going on. You have a hard time tracking get good numbers on just how prevalent rapes and sexual crimes are, and where they also track the perpetrator's background. But you managed to do a pretty good job to track down numbers anyway. But one question I would ask is how certain can you be that this is actually a problem where the perpetrators are foreign-born or children of foreign-born?
So, in terms of the data gathering, I also describe it in the book, the steps that I take to find out who is behind this spike in sexual violence against women in many parts of Europe. And the first step, of course, is to approach the authorities whose job it is to gather this data. And what you find if you were to follow the exact same steps that I did is the authorities will say to you, we do not make any record of the perpetrator's religious, ethnic, or cultural background. And that's just as a matter of policy. This is, for instance, in Germany, it was very clear that they just don't do that. And not only that, even journalists are told through a code of conduct to avoid writing down, reporting some of these characteristics. So, you try and get to the next step. I look at all the different laws. The way the laws change and the definition of sexual violence has changed. I obviously looked at all the anecdotal evidence that I could gather. And then I started to interview policymakers, law enforcement people, and journalists, along with survivors. So women who were assaulted and survived it and who were willing to talk. And then on top of that, I tried to get as many court cases as I could. And in some countries, it's easier than others. But when you put all of that data together, you do come to the same conclusion that there is a correlation between this spike in immigration and the spike in sexual violence against women in the countries that took large numbers of immigrants. And then from there, you start to try and explain why is it that then these men, if such a correlation is right, why is it that these men are behaving the way that they do towards women? Now, when I'll go back to the word correlation, the conclusion in the book is that we need to do extra research, make extra efforts at data gathering. But the first step would be for these agencies to actually start gathering that data and lift that policy. I think for most of Europe, I think it is a big challenge to start putting some of these data points on paper. And this book focuses on sexual violence. But there are other things that I've been seeing that are going on that very few people have written about. For instance, the spike in anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish violence, the spike in anti-homosexual, anti-gay violence, all of these things. And then there is some type of violent crimes that I still think in order to understand what's happening, who's doing it, why, and most importantly, to develop programs to challenge this. I think there's no way around trying to establish these data points. Ethnicity, religion, culture, it's going to matter more and more.
So I'm going to act the devil's advocate.
Please do.
Throughout, but one thing, a reason why, I mean, in Sweden they have the data. They have the data of the background, but they don't publish it. They stopped publishing it in the latest. It was in 2005. The state agency BRÅ But so when people have argued that they should be transparent and they should publish, you should be able to track what's happening on these parameters. Then they said, but why? Why do you want that data? So why is it so important to know the perpetrator's ethnicity, religion, country of origin, when we know that the crime is there? So isn't it better to work with the crime than risking stigmatizing religions, ethnicities, and
Right.
so yeah.
So I think that's a good question, and this question has been asked many times over several decades in several European countries, and the answer has always been the wrong answer. The answer not to reach the conclusion that being transparent about these data points is going to lead to a stigmatization of individuals who happen to be immigrant and who are completely innocent of these crimes, I think is wrong. I don't think that the fear of stigmatization is justified. The reason why many of these European countries don't want to publish the data has to do with their own history. So in Germany, for instance, it is a fear that the German population is not only going to stigmatize immigrants, but that they will organize violently against immigrants. And it's the same fear in France and in Germany and in some of the Scandinavian countries. But is this fear justified? I don't think it is. I think Germany is not where it was in the 1920s and 30s. I think the German population of today has evolved, and they are not genocidal. Let me just be blunt with you. I don't think that these European populations are genocidal. And if you make a trade-off in terms of being transparent about the data versus hiding it, I think the trade-off would be, if we make everything transparent, first of all, we understand it, because you can't solve a problem that you don't understand. And you can't reduce the problem only to crimes committed. Yes, crimes are committed, but once the police and prosecutors go after the criminals, if they ever get a conviction, then even such a punishment is understood by some of the perpetrators to be so lenient that as soon as the punishment is done, they go back and do the same thing again. Because they don't understand, the perpetrators haven't yet understood why the environment that they are in is different from the environment where their attitudes toward women were first established. And so I think there is no hiding from culture. Number one. Number two, due to the lack of transparency, you create a void in which far-right parties, populist parties, and other charlatans like the Russian trolls, they fill that void. And they now exchange information that's not accurate, that's exaggerated, and often that's lied. I mean, there were 3 rapists in Spain. I think one of them, it's in the book, but one of them was Cuban, one was Spanish, and maybe the other one was Argentinian. I'm not sure. But the Russian media reported that as being Arab Middle Eastern men. So in order to avoid that kind of confusion and empowering these wrong individuals and organizations, the best policy is honesty and transparency. And then from there, you go to the next point, which is, okay, why are these men behaving in the ways that they're doing? And what is it that we can do aside from punishments and prisons?
I want to move on to that question in a while. I'll just one study that came out, I think, because your book was postponed because of COVID for a few months, and during that time a study came out in Sweden, which is the largest scientific study ever of convicted rapists in Sweden. And it tracked, by using information from Swedish Crime Register, it tracked offenders between 15 and 60 years old. who committed rape and were convicted of it between 2000 and 2015. And a total of 3,039 offenders were included in the analysis. And it turned out almost 60% were immigrants, 59.3%. But when the study was published in late February, the mainstream media stayed silent. So Ardavan Kosnood, the criminologist behind the study, he said that he was very surprised by the lack of interest, because otherwise when he publishes studies, he always gets calls from journalists. But this time they were silent. So, I mean, it's sort of, he did what the state agencies has not done. And yet the journalists were quite, the only ones who were really interested were what's called alternative media outlets, or which he found was problematic, because then he got associated with them. So I just wanted your reflection on
on that. And while we're reflecting on it, so 60% of the perpetrators immigrant, but what is the percentage of immigrants in Sweden? The total population of immigrants in Sweden is it's less than 10%. So if less than 10% of the population is immigrant, and they're responsible for 60% of that type of crime, I mean, it tells you everything. And I don't think that it is going to, the smear campaign against the person who did the research and his agency is not going to stick. What is going to stick, however, is the distrust against the mainstream media, that the general population is going to stop believing in the mainstream media. And that, I think, is very dangerous for democracy. People will either go to the alternative media, or they can, stories and rumors will swirl, and people will seek their information from other sources that are very far from accurate. But the reason why the journalists were silent is understandable. It's what we talked about earlier. Politicians, journalists, academic researchers, they have all come to, in my view, the wrong conclusion, that if we are transparent about these things, we're going to empower the wrong groups. But it's been counterproductive. It's the silence and the taboo and this sweeping of everything under the carpet. That's what empowers the alternative media, the populists, the far right, and the people who want to make mischief for the sake of making mischief. Transparency really is the answer. And again, I insist, because that is going to take us to a place where we will understand the problem, the culture, these young boys who are going out in groups of 2, 3, 4 and attacking girls and women. What is it that shapes their attitude towards girls and women? You have to understand that, because you want to, if you understand it, you want to help them change this attitude so that influences their behavior. You can't understand that if you say, I'm not going to look at the cultural norms. I'm just not going to look at the cultural norms. Yeah. So I think that's what's been going on in Europe. And sadly, we are now in a place, because of the volume, just the simple quantity of these attacks, that we can't look away anymore.
We had a debate in Sweden a few years back, where women with an immigrant background, Nalin Pekul, Celia Dagli, Aminika Kabave, they wrote about how women's freedom were being curtailed, especially in what's called utsatta områden in Swedish. I mean the immigrant majority areas, and that like moral police were attacking women or criticizing them, and they were on them if they didn't have the right appropriate, in their view, appropriate dress.
Yeah.
So we had a debate in the TV on SVT, and I was in that debate, and the whole debate started circulating around my skin color instead. So I had a white savior complex, and it was shameful that me as a white majority Swede wanted to criticize and stigmatize. So the whole question of women's rights disappeared, because the question of racism trumped the question
Everything.
of everything. So
Yeah.
I don't think the left who were the left wing people who were there at the debate made a great showing of themselves, but it was symptomatic of a mood, and I think that mood is still going on. But then it was just the women in those areas. What you show in your book is that it's a much wider problem.
Yes. And that takes me back to culture. I mean, you said it's an immigrant majority neighborhood, but let's be honest and explicit about the fact that it's also a Muslim majority neighborhood. And with that comes the culture that women are supposed to behave according to an honor code or a modesty code or chastity, whatever. I'm trying to translate it from the original languages into English. But these girls are supposed to be virgins until they're married, and even after they're married, they're supposed to behave in certain ways that are seen to be modest, cover themselves, obey their husbands, etc. And the moral police that you talked about within these neighborhoods are enforcing those laws. They are trying to prevent these young girls who are growing up in Sweden from adopting Swedish norms and values and the emancipation that Swedish women enjoyed up until now. So that's what I mean by let's be explicit and honest about these cultures. So these Muslim majority neighborhood, in many ways, in informal ways, is a replica of the countries of origin that some of these communities come from. I've seen the same thing in France, in Germany, in Holland, in the United Kingdom. Once a neighborhood, the numbers flip so that now there is a Muslim majority, the social control for the Muslim women goes up. There are women who don't want to wear the headscarf, they're forced to wear the headscarf. They want to finish university, they are not allowed to. They don't want to marry the men that their families force upon them, but they're forced to do it anyway. And they are forced to be within those neighborhoods, they are forced to live by that honor code. And for many years, many of these European countries ignored that reality and they dismissed it as, well, it's their culture, it's their religion. So when there were incidents, reports of honor killings, of honor violence, of forced marriages, of female genital mutilation, I think most European countries, there would be a hype, there would be a big reporting of it because it was something strange and new. And then the next stage would be to have a discussion about what should the larger society, what should the majority do to help these girls. And the de facto solution was just leave things as they are. If there are murders, in some cases, there were convictions, but very often these women were abandoned. And now the number of men who come from that type of culture are in the country in large enough groups that they're not only affecting Muslim women and immigrant women in immigrant majority neighborhoods. This has spilled over to the rest of society, and now we're in a place where we can't ignore it. And I think you look away from a small, vulnerable minority, which are the Muslim women, and now we're on to the next stage, women in general. What is Sweden going to do? What is the left going to do? You know, are we going to maintain the rule of law? If there's any rule of law left in Sweden, by the way, or are we still going to talk about moral superiority and in my view, issues that are absolutely irrelevant, such as the color of your skin?
And what you describe, I mean, we have code words. We talk about diversity, we talk about multiculturalism, but what you're describing is more of a monoculture that's establishing in many parts of Europe and especially in Sweden.
Yes.
So it's not really multiculturalism or diversity. It's one culture code, so to speak, that's establishing itself as the dominant one. And
It's an Islamist culture. It's an Islamist culture that is dominating these neighborhoods and forcing itself on the inhabitants of those neighborhoods. I still think it's a minority, but it's a very vocal minority that is determined to dominate. And the majority is giving them the opportunity to do that.
Yeah. And why? I mean, it's so... some things are hidden behind statistics as well. I mean, if you look at the number of young people with an immigrant background in the big cities in Sweden, for example, you get a much higher number than if you look at the number of immigrants in the
countryside.
population, in the countryside and the population as a whole. So in Malmö, I think it's 2/3 of all people under 25 that's either immigrants or children of immigrants. So then you have very large numbers. I mean, if you look at if we move on to the question of how to integrate people, then the integration implies that it's a majority or a dominant culture with certain views on women's rights, for example, that are in a position to integrate. But in some places in Europe, it's that culture, so to speak, is more of an idea than an actual presence. So you have like a Swedish culture, but it's not really present in these areas. It's not really present. I mean, you can have police officers going there or state agencies, but they leave when their work shifts are done, and then the status quo can proceed, so to speak. So I wanted your view on how do you view the prospects of integrating these people, so to speak?
So what I think happened in many of these countries, including your country in Sweden, is this ghettoization was allowed to happen, and it came about in a number of ways. When the majority, members of the native white Christian or secular populations, felt that they were unhappy in these neighborhoods, they moved out. Those who could afford moved out. And more immigrants and their children were housed in these neighborhoods. So over time, what then just happened, and it's, I think in some places it was quite organic, it wasn't anything planned. People from certain backgrounds, they want to be together, they want to live together, they understand each other's norms and values and cultures, they're comfortable with one another. And the white Swedes who are not, they left. So I don't think that was imposed by the government. That was something that happened organically. But in a society like yours, and again, your society is a replica of many European societies. The government is expected to intervene in such developments at certain points and mitigate certain outcomes, like the outcome that we are talking about now, where in fact, yes, some of these neighborhoods, aside from the police and some other service providers, it really is a country in a country. It's got several names. It's been called parallel societies. That's now what the French president is trying to undo. He's passed a law where he's saying, we have to stop this Islamist separatism, using the word separatism. And it's really a matter of time before there are attempts to have these neighborhoods formally separated. Now they're informally separated. And this separation is de facto accepted. But it's just a matter of time before people start demanding that this separation become formal. In the United Kingdom, it has happened because they have lobbied for and they have found willing ears within the British government that you can now have disputes resolved according to Sharia law, marriages and divorces taking place according to Sharia law, polygamous marriages taking place according to Sharia law. And de facto, the rest of the society is forced to accept it. And a lot of acceptance came about through this process of avoidance. People not wanting to get to, after a few confrontations, they don't like the outcome, so they go. So the question now is, well, what is the role of the government in this? In those separate neighborhoods or separate societies, is it going to be the Swedish law and the Swedish constitution that's going to govern them, or is it going to be these codes from the backgrounds of immigrants? And that is the struggle we're looking at now.
The social services in Sweden, you can make a worry complaint if you think that children are being mistreated, abused, or worse, and they will make an investigation. And the problem is that what's been established is that you have two separate law systems, so to speak, because if it's a majority Swedish family, then you can do you have a much higher put a much higher how do you say, threshold for what you can accept. But if it's an immigrant family, you have much lower standards, like the racism of low expectations. So you don't enforce the same laws, because
Absolutely.
I think it was somebody from the social services said that if we would really implement the law, then we would take so many kids from immigrants.
Yes.
And so that's also, I mean, we are already in a situation, I would say, where we don't uphold the law in Sweden, at least. And
it's not just in Sweden, it's also in Britain, it's in France, it's in Germany, it's in Holland, it's any country, any European country that has taken in
Vi på Fortum gör allt det där med elen enkelt och tryggt. Med vår smarta app har du alltid full koll, vare sig det handlar om din elanvändning eller morgondagens elpriser. Så byt till Fortum, Nordens mest valda elbolag. Upptäck kraften i nordisk energi.
Upptäck Ford e-Custom, elversionen av Europas mest sålda transportbil. Den har upp till 370 kilometers räckvidd, snabbladdning och finns nu med fyrhjulsdrift. Just nu till Ford Pro Edition-pris från 479 000 ex-moms. Läs mer på Ford.se eller besök din Ford-återförsäljare. Ready, set, Ford.
Tänk om din plånbok kunde prata. Vad skulle den då säga om din relation till ekonomi?
Alla relationer har ju sina ups and downs. Men att han har lån lite här och där, det tror jag skulle vara en ick för rätt många plånböcker och inte bara för mig.
Ett första steg mot en bättre relation till sin plånbok kan vara att samla sina lån.
Samla dina lån till ett på lendo.se.
A considerable number of immigrants. And I pointed this out in Holland when we were there, that if I'm a victim of parental abuse or domestic violence and I'm white and native, the state is going to intervene and I'll be put in a foster home, in a women's shelter. The state is going to intervene. The perpetrators are going to be punished. But we got to a point, this was 20 years ago, we got to a point where in these separate neighborhoods, if you happen to be of Moroccan origin or Turkish origin, and you're born in the Netherlands, and you are subjected to domestic abuse, you're subjected to child marriage, female genital mutilation. The social workers, they know this, they take their notes, they report it to their bosses, and very often nothing happens. The child stays. I know of some cases early on where they had sent some children to foster homes, and that didn't work out. Obviously, foster children always come, regardless of where they come from. They come with a number of challenges, but they didn't have enough foster homes to place the immigrant children in. And as a result of that, what happened was just passivity. They just let things happen.
Yeah.
And that led then, I think, to the parents, the leadership within these communities, a lot of people who are responsible for the abuse itself, they came to the conclusion, we're going to get away with it. There are no consequences. And now here we are in a place where this was affecting a relatively small number of children and spouses. And now you have conversations in Europe, like in your country, about the future of social cohesion.
Yeah, and we are now talking about we have the school vouchers in Sweden, friskolor. So you bring the money with the pupils, so to speak. You can choose the school for yourself, and so we have had like organic segregation, also separate from the segregation geographical segregation, and now the government is talking about busing people from majority Swedish schools where they are the majority to minority majority schools. So we're having protests by parents because of that, and so we're having we're having. Are we gonna stay together? But we're gonna bus people. It's the same dynamic as you've had in many other countries before, but now we're having it in Sweden because we've, so to speak, we had a lot of systems in place where we can kick the bucket down the road, so to speak. We have large-scale immigration, but we have a lot of opt-out solutions.
Yeah.
So we have
absolutely that.
So we have not been faced with many of the problems. But now it used to be like in the 90s we had lots of problems with criminality and immigrant and violence and stuff like that, gangs. But it was concentrated to the big cities, Malmö, Gothenburg, and Stockholm. But now it's in every part of Sweden, and so there's no more places to kick the bucket to, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think that is a wake-up call, and it is really. I think Sweden is at a crossroads, and it's what happens next, because all the sensible conversations about immigration and whether you should select your immigrants or not, we've said if you start a conversation like that, you're racist, you're xenophobic, so that's silenced. The conversation about borders, that you just don't go there, because people who talk about borders and national identities, they're supposedly racist, so that's being shut down. The gentrification, which is this, instead of busing, there used to be all sorts of, and they've been tried in many, I live in the United States, so I've seen some of the attempts at gentrification, and some of them have been successful, some of them have not been so successful. But this idea that you are going to try and mix neighborhoods, and very, very poor neighborhoods with a lot of crime and a lot of grime, that you're going to bring in some kind of intervention to bring back economic stability, law and order, so that it's attractive for young people to move into. And this has been tried, but again, that also has been, we're told that's Islamophobic and it's racist and so on. So all the sensible avenues of trying to resolve this issue, they have been shut down. People have been smeared. People are exhausted. You want to have this conversation, but 5 years from now, if you look back and you see nothing has changed, if anything has changed, things have gone backwards, you move on with your life. And that's what's happening I see happening in many European countries, until you get to the point where France is at now. Because in France, the volume of the problem is so big now, there is nowhere else to go. They're about to, if you look at the election of 5 years ago and then the coming election, in both of these, Front National is on the brink of winning. And if you look at the agenda, the political agenda, it's all about this issue about immigration, radical Islam, national identity, borders, because Marine Le Pen is willing to say these things and therefore capturing a lot of the votes, and the establishment parties are not doing that. But now they're on the brink of, according to some of the ex-generals writing a letter, they've been in sort of an emergency state. They've had lots of terrorist attacks. Many people have died. And these separatist neighborhoods, you can't look away from them. So it's a mess. It's a big mess. And it's very, very difficult to turn these things around. I still think that Sweden has some hope, but the Swedes have to act now. And you have to make a choice between which value system you want to govern you. Do you want the Islamist, Middle Eastern Islamist type of value system, or do you want the Swedish constitution? It's a very stark choice, but that is the choice.
This makes me think about the novel Submission by Michel Beck.
Yeah.
And it was mislabeled as Islamophobic, but it was deeply Francophobic, I would say. It was a very sharp criticism of his home country, because in it the identitarian or the right-wing party that's trying to grab power, all the liberals and left-wing parties united with the Islamist party because they were more afraid of the right-wing extremism or the right-wing populism than they were of the Islamism. And it was sort of the criticism is we can't see when we're more afraid of our past than we are of our future, so to speak. We are more afraid that the 30s in Sweden, we have it's become so misused that it's a joke. This is how the 30s began. Yeah. So that's it's being reiterated so many times that it's very hard to take it seriously. But I mean, of course, some things should be taken seriously. But the 30s is always returning. It's been returning since the 90s in Sweden. In every debate when it comes, it's always returning. And
when you told me about the 1990s in Sweden, when you had the crime waves, and this was associated with immigrant communities, I think that was the time to say, here we have a foretaste of what things could look like 30, 40 years from now. That was the time to have had conversations about borders and about selecting who you let in and who you don't, and also about the deportations. People who don't fit in, who are committing crimes over and over again. Sweden, any country would have the right to say, okay, you're not going to live here anymore. You have to go back to your country of origin. This is unacceptable. That would have been a sensible policy. But instead, you went down this rabbit hole of xenophobia, and then later on, Islamophobia came around as a trendy word. And meanwhile, the population of immigrants from countries that are Muslim majority, with all the problems that they have, the numbers of immigrants coming in were getting higher and higher, plus the birth rate. So the problem was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the bigger the problem became, the bigger the taboo, the desire not to want to talk about it. And now you're in a place, as you described to me, and you're not the only one. I've spoken to many Swedish people who are saying, in Sweden, there is no place to go. I was explaining to one of your Swedish journalists who interviewed me for his podcast. He said, what happens in America when you have these far left policies take privilege, or they prevail? And I said, well, if you live in California and you don't like the policies, you just move to Texas. And he said, in Sweden or Utah or Montana or Idaho or someplace else. And he said, we don't have that now. It's exhausted. In Sweden, people have moved everywhere and the problem has moved with them. There's nowhere else to go. And that's what I mean by a crossroads. And now you have the choice, whose values are going to prevail, whose culture is going to prevail.
Yeah, and in the 90s, we had a more frank media than we do now. So they were explicit sometimes with who were the perpetrators and who were the victims. But what happened was that also you had a mobilization of neo-Nazis in Sweden. So we had we have more neo-Nazis in Sweden than we did more than our Scandinavian neighbors. So the debate started concerning those the reaction rather than the root cause, I would say. And also the Sweden Democrats were growing. So the debate started to shift in the other direction. Instead of going the way you said, the debate started being about
Neo-Nazis.
actually, yeah, and also in the parliament, the liberal and the right-wing parties were criticizing the social democratic government to be having too tough border restrictions. So they found sort of a way to, because the right wing is always the evil ones because they want lower taxes and stuff like that. But they found like a question where they could be the good ones. So you had a whole generation of right wing youth politicians and later on their mother parties having a line where they criticized the left-wing government to being too hard on immigration. So it's a strange dynamic in Sweden. But
it's a strange dynamic. But I think also what it tells me is that there were all of these very local conflicts or cleavages. It's not really a conflict between the left and the right. And that when these external problems like immigration and globalization started to happen, not only Sweden did it, but also other countries in Europe did it, they tried to squeeze everything into this left-right dynamic. And some of these problems have nothing to do with that. And you won't understand them if you try and squeeze them into this left-right dynamic. It doesn't work that way. And I think in this case, what I've seen some good examples like Denmark, maybe Austria is another second one, where you don't have, whether you want more or less immigration is not seen as an exercise in who's on the left, who's on the right. But the left and the right can actually sit together and say, what kind of immigration do we want? And what kind of values and culture. And I think that Denmark is onto something. Their population is small enough. Their country is large enough. And their leadership is, again, small enough to want to be able to actually sit together.
Yeah.
And then differ. So it's the Social Democratic Party who leads the coalition in Denmark that is behind this, and it's not in extreme by any means, but it's behind this scala of changes and policies where integration is now number one. Integration into the Danish value system, not into the Middle Eastern tribal Islamist value system, but the Danish system. And that's the approach I think that Sweden should take and others should take, while it's still possible.
Yeah. And you, if you go back to the book, you can also see like some of these things that we are talking about. It's on a very some of it is on a very general and idea-based scale. But one of the things you track is how the naturalists, the nudists of Germany, how they've gotten fewer. And I think many of those cases are very interesting because I actually did as a freelance journalist, one of my first things was to go to a naturalist beach in Sweden. So I was surrounded by like 10 naked people, and they were wanting me to remove my clothes. I'm not, but I removed my shirt, but not my pants. And my photographer, she removed her pants, but not her shirt. So together we were naked. But they actually, one of the things that stuck with me through the years from that article was that they had problems with people coming to their beach. And it was starting to, and who didn't understand what they were doing. And they were lying in the bushes and they were approaching the women. So they were actually talking about the things that you go to a much greater detail in the book. So that's like a case study of what's happening really, where you have, I mean, of course it's a very specific part of the culture, but it's still very interesting.
It is a case study in the sense that it illustrates yet again, and in a different way, the cultural norms, the way the European norms have evolved, and they are so, so different. When I was living in the Netherlands in the 1990s, the 2000s, I was a student, and my student friends they would bring back the holiday pictures. They went to Indonesia, they went to Morocco, Turkey, whatever. They went to wherever there's the sunshine on the summer vacation, and they would show topless pictures. And they would say, it's so weird that these Moroccans or Indonesians and so on, they object to this. Why would they object to? And I remember that was maybe a foretaste of these differences. The European woman simply could not understand what the problem was. And it's
I remember going to Tunisia with my then girlfriend, and we were out in the water, and she was, of course, in her bra and bathing suit. But like when I left, I went up from the water, like men closed in on her. So then I went into the water again, and then they removed themselves, and then I went up again, and then they closed in. So it was sort of a strange dance around that.
And for them, it is of course very strange, because it in their cultural environment, that's bizarre. That doesn't happen. And if it happens, it is something to behold. And so again, why deny? Why pretend that these cultural differences do not exist, or that they don't have consequences? If you go to Egypt or Tunisia or Algeria or Morocco or Turkey, or you come, down the Sahel to the rest of Africa, and you're a woman, you're alone, you dress like a European woman, you behave like a European woman, you're going to run into trouble very, very quickly. It doesn't have to be in some anthropological book. It's in The Lonely Planet. When I was younger, we used to put on those big backpacks and try and travel around on a budget.
Yeah.
And The Lonely Planet tells you, the tour guide books tells you, cover your hands and cover your legs. And this is the neighborhood where you can relax because it's Europeanized. And this is the neighborhood where you should be careful. Now, what are we getting? We're getting people from the rural areas, from the remote areas in the Middle East, in South Asia, in Africa, flooding into Europe. And they're bringing with them their way of life and their worldview. And they look at Europe and they're appalled. They're just like those young men who saw your girlfriend in a swimsuit. Why are we in denial about it? We've known this for a very, very long time. And that has consequences.
Yeah, and one thing, actually, I went back into the media archives to read what they wrote in the 90s, and they interviewed young guys in 2000, and they were very explicit on how they viewed Swedish women.
Yes,
like he made like a gaffe, and
a gesture.
He called the Swedish horse, and then he corrected.
Yes.
No, I mean Swedish girls. One of the guys, and he was ashamed, but because it was so revealing on how he viewed it. But he also said that if you go out, he actually, it's like an interview that so very clearly shows what you show in your book in much greater detail. But he was very honest, and they interviewed 4 guys who were in their late teens. And they were still in high school, and they were like, but if you go out to a party and you're a girl and you have no male siblings or father, nobody's protecting you, then you're asking for it. I'm not saying that it's right. They were not like trying. They were very explicit. They were not condoning rape, but they were like, but it's sort of not really rape. But it's of course you should not do it, but it's.
But if it happens, it's her fault.
Yes, exactly. So they had very mixed feelings about this, and like one of the guys were protesting, saying like, no, it's always wrong, but she shouldn't do it, but it's always wrong to do it. So he was like the good one. But all that dynamic, like you see that people they are from the same culture, but they didn't have exactly the same views on it, but they were still explaining, like, of course you can have Swedish girlfriends, but if you want to marry, you marry a Muslim girl.
Yes, because she's a virgin and she's modest, and she's going to be submissive, and she's going to obey the honor code and the modesty code. That is exactly how it is. in so many different countries that you are now having thousands of immigrants come to you from. And in addition to this glaring cultural difference is also the demographic. You're getting maybe 70-80% of young men coming in without families. And because the journey from Africa or the Middle East or South Asia, it's treacherous, it's with smugglers. It's like Odysseus trying to cross all of these obstacles.
Yeah.
And so it's not easy for young women to make this journey, or for families to make this journey. So for the longest time, another thing that you can easily anticipate is in the coming decades, only young men will be able to make this crossing. And then you get an accumulation of large numbers of young men without women. And then you're going to have the male-female ratio off, which in Sweden is already the case, according to Valerie Hudson, one of the demographers that I interviewed. She said it's already off. And anywhere you get that, even if you put culture aside, that's asking for a lot of trouble.
Yeah. So you have like a proposal for a solution in the book, like how you can approach this, and you suggest that you might have like education for young men and for immigrants, like this is how we behave, and if you accept this then you can stay, and if you don't accept it or you go foul of it then you cannot stay here. But
I think the first step is to go back to common sense and to rationality and reason. I think it is for the leadership, the established leadership on the left and the right, to come together and say, these issues have nothing to do with our left-right cleavage, the local native stuff. It has nothing to do with that. And it's something that's affecting all of us. It's even affecting the immigrants. We early on, we talked about how that affects immigrant women.
Yeah.
And then from there, I think it's to start dealing with the reality of immigration and the reality of globalization, and what is Sweden's place in that? Is Sweden just simply going to be swallowed up by these events, and it's going to become like another Algerian suburb? It's in a big world. Sweden is very small. So are you just going to say, let it drift off into whatever it becomes? Or is there something worth preserving? And if you then think you have something worth preserving and you have the means to do that, then I think now is the time to say we will start thinking very intensely about integration. I actually prefer to call it assimilation, because it's an assimilation into the value system. See what works and what doesn't work, and for whom, and for those who don't want to be, I'm talking about the immigrants who don't want to adopt the most basic Swedish laws, values, norms. I think that it is very important to develop a program of going back home, the country of origin or the country of origin of the parents. And then those who really make the choice and who say, okay, I want to live the rest of my life in Sweden, I want to take advantage of the opportunities, but I pledge to abide by the law, abide by the values, then give them an opportunity to do that. But you have to be very, very clear about this now. And in that you will need the Swedish population to come in and say, then we will open our schools to the young children. And there'll be no protests, because then you do it as a country together. It's really a moment of crisis. And if you open the schools to the young children, that gives then these young immigrant children the opportunity to adapt much faster than their parents.
Well, one last question is, you track this in Great Britain, but I think it's also the case in Sweden, is that you have immigrants from Lebanon, for example, and the Christian Lebanese are better at integrating. I'm not sure if it's Australia you take, but then you also compare the Sikh and the Hindu in Great Britain, and they have a easier time integrating and also outperforming the majority population on some measures. But you have the Pakistani and the Bangladeshi having a much harder time. And in Sweden, you have these patterns as well. So there seems to be like a sticky problem of Islam.
And that sticky problem is Islam, because Islamic norms, Islam, unlike Christianity and other religions, it's not an orthodoxy, it's an orthopraxy. You're required to practice it. You're required to do things, or you're required not to do things. And so the infrastructure of dawah is this proselytization in the mosques and so on. They're exhorting people to refrain from becoming or adopting Swedish norms, French norms, British norms, and so on. And then you have, and I got this from the book by Ruth Koopmans, who really went ahead and did an empirical study, not just an analysis of anthropology and cultural differences, but he went all over the Western world and started looking at how these different populations were doing according to some indicators, which is education, employment, women's rights, these types of things. And he says, if you look at these things in minority communities in Western society, it reflects the majority countries in the Muslim world. They're struggling with exactly the same problems. So if you open your eyes to that and you say, okay, that's a fact, what are we going to do about this? Then I think you are going to have to compel Muslim immigrants and their children as individuals to make a choice. If you want to live and you choose to live by some of these Islamic tenets, Sweden is not the right place for you, because Sweden is not governed by Sharia law. Britain is not governed by Sharia law. And so you bring this back to where it needs to be, which is the individual choice. You choose, and if you want to leave, you from Pakistan and you want to live by Sharia law, it's not possible in Sweden, but there is a path to go back to Pakistan and try it there. I think that would also create the kind of honesty that's missing in the relationship between the immigrant and the host society. And when I talk about selective immigration, that's what I mean. Are you willing to adapt to the norms, the values, the laws? If not, you have the choice to go back. And then to say, but I can't go back to my country because there is a civil war, there's this. Then you've made the choice to adopt these values. Yeah. And this is how human beings have been living together for the longest time. It's only now that there's a fantasy that it's possible to have it both ways. And it really is just that. It's a fantasy.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, for coming on.
Ivar, thank you so much for having me, and good luck to you and your country. And maybe you can come out of your hiding place in the Virgin's cage.
Yes. Och stort tack till dig som har lyssnat. Gå gärna in och skriv en recension på Apple Podcasts och säg vad du tycker. Har du några synpunkter eller frågor så mejla mig på ivar.arpi@gmail.com. Och det här är alltså en del av en större publikation som heter Rak höger med Ivar Arpi. Den hittar ni på ivararpi.se. Tack och hej!
När ett barn blir allvarligt sjukt behöver du hantera en ny vardag. Men det finns stöd att få. Ronald McDonald Hus ger familjer möjligheten att bo tillsammans medan barnet vårdas på sjukhus. Vill du ge fler familjer samma möjlighet? Swisha till 970 22.